Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Target Free Thursday Night at the Walker Art Center. My name is Sarah Peters. I direct public programs here, and I want to thank you all for coming. And I want to extend a special welcome to visitors to the Twin Cities this weekend who are here for the association or the Organization of American Historians Conference, which is taking place in downtown Minneapolis. Welcome. Thank you so much for visiting our city. I am extremely pleased that the timing has worked out so that your visit here lines up so well with our exhibition of work by Kara Walker and the talk tonight with Kevin Gaines. I hope that something that you see or hear at the Walker this weekend and this evening sparks some new thinking for you as you continue with the conference and your panels and discussions. I would like to thank a few people at OAH for their work in helping these connections get made. Annette Igra was immensely helpful, not only in getting information about tonight's talk into the channels of communication for the conference, but also was very generous with her time and ideas in some early brainstorming sessions that we had for thinking about related programs to the Kara Walker Show. So thank you, Annette, for that. I also would like to thank Amy Stark, the conference manager, for working to get information about the Walker in general into the conference materials. And while I'm at it, I would also like to thank my colleague in public programs, Frida Fair, for her hard work and her brilliant ideas that have led to the formation of all of these programs. So for those of you who do live in the area, this talk we're partway into a series of programs related to the Kara Walker exhibition. There are 3 more talks and 1 more gallery dialogue left. There is information about those in your program notes. There are also some small bronze-colored brochures that you can pick up at the desk that outline all of the programs. We hope to see you back with your questions. Lastly, I do want to note that we are recording the lecture this evening so that it can be archived on the Walker channel, which is our archive of lectures. So when we get to the Q&A session at the end, please use the microphones that the ushers will have in the aisle to ask your questions so that your voices get recorded. Tonight's lecture is one of several talks, gallery conversations, and art-making experiences that attempt to contextualize the work found in the exhibition Kara Walker, My Complement, My Enemy, My Oppressor, My Love, which is currently on view in galleries 4, 5, and 6 on the other end of the building. Featuring roughly a decade of Walker's artistic production, this installation allows her complex subject matter to command attention, as it is prone to do, while also leaving space for it to breathe and stretch into our imaginations. The historical setting for much of Walker's work is the antebellum South, and while she uses this as a backdrop, Walker does not represent a necessarily truthful depiction of history. Fact, fiction, and fantasy are intertwined. Exaggerated truths and fictionalized events parade as history lessons that viewers must unpack and sort out to ultimately decide for themselves what is true. This collusion of fact and fiction is exactly what artists have the license to do. Historians, on the other hand, are not supposed to do that. We look to them for scholarship that has sifted through fiction and revisionist notions of the past to compile ideas rooted in truth. Unfortunately, not everyone plays by these rules, and many of the official stories that Americans learn early in our education are full of interpretations informed by the biases of racism, classism, and sexism. But tonight, here to get us back on track is Kevin Gaines, professor of history and the director of the Center for Afroamerican and African Studies at the University of Michigan. I imagine that Gaines does not need so much of an introduction in a crowd like this, but for you curious novices of history out there, and I include myself among you, I will say that Gaines offers an important retelling of the history of struggles within the Black diaspora for political, social, and economic justice and sovereignty. And this work serves to correct or expansively build upon the limited knowledge many Americans have of our nation's racialized past. Like other scholars, he works to expose the historical construction of racial categories, illuminating one of the many tangible manifestations of those constructions, which is racism. Gaines has made a career out of investigating the history of African Americans in the U.S., as well as American expatriates in Africa, as they created networks of transnational solidarity that informed Black politics back in the U.S. By studying issues of political consciousness from the past, Gaines inevitably gives us a lot to think about regarding the present, in much the same way that Kara Walker does. So let the connections begin. Please welcome Kevin Gaines.
Thank you, Sarah, for that generous introduction, and I'd like to thank the Walker and their Public Programmings Department for inviting me here and giving me the opportunity to think about Kara Walker's work. And what I'd like to do tonight is not to claim that Walker is distorting the historical record, and I'm here as the historian to represent historical truth. Far from that. Nothing would be more boring than that. What I hope to do tonight is to talk about some of the stereotypes and ideologies of race that Walker's work evokes, and to provide you with a context for engaging with the work of Kara Walker. So my goal in showing you many offensive images of my own choosing over the course of the evening is to show how these visual stereotypes of blackness and whiteness serve the function of upholding and justifying a social order defined by white privilege and anti-black subordination. Now, it would seem that in viewing this retrospective of Kara Walker's work, we're embarking on a journey into a past that many would just as soon forget. Many Americans, regardless of their background, want very badly to believe that the civil rights movement has forever exorcised those demons of slavery and racial segregation. Many people who identify as white wish not to be held responsible for crimes that occurred long before their birth. And for quite different reasons, there are plenty of people of African descent who are keenly invested in forgetting from whence they came. The playwright Arthur Miller once remarked that the role of the artist is to remind their audiences of the things that they would most want to forget. Kara Walker's work reminds us that, to quote Faulkner, the past is not dead. It is not even past. Her work asks us to consider that for all the progress that the nation has made in race relations, we're still divided by race, both socially and at the level of human relationships. Walker's use of silhouettes and her reimaginings of plantation slavery as a Gothic site of violence, sexual abuse, and conflicted desire reminds us that Americans remain haunted by the demons unleashed by a history of slavery and racial and sexual oppression. Walker's black-white figurations of interracial conflict, violence, vulgarity, and desire are a mirror held up to ourselves and our own society's deepest yet unspoken fears and desires. Okay, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. You can meditate on these images. Walker's work is not solely about slavery and its legacy. Slavery is merely one of the multiple historical contexts which her work engages with and challenges. Walker's ascendancy in the art world coincided with the 1990s, which was a dismal decade for the nation's racial politics. We live in a maddeningly paradoxical post-civil rights moment, really a continuation of America's protracted post-slavery era. Racist ideas and images are both everywhere and nowhere. Invoking the ideal of a colorblind society, federal courts and states are rejecting race-conscious policies for addressing past and continuing discrimination, a turn of events that is certain to solidify the privileges of whites. On the one hand, the crudest anti-black minstrel stereotypes, which were so pervasive in the mass media before the civil rights movement, are largely absent within a politically correct popular culture. At the same time, throughout the 1980s and 1990s, political campaigns and news media accounts viewed crime, welfare dependency, and illegitimacy as the unique pathologies of black people. Such widespread depictions of blacks as non-citizens, lacking a legitimate claim on the resources and protections of the state, fueled the aspirations of overtly racist politicians such as David Duke. Duke was not the only politician in these years to benefit from such blatant racial coding, which, under the guidance of GOP strategist Lee Atwater, was featured in the campaigns of Presidents Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. These and other uses of racially charged rhetoric helped persuade many Americans to reject New Deal liberalism and its core assumption that government can improve the lives of its citizens. It was the 1990s that gave us the expression driving while black to describe racial profiling by law enforcement officials. During the Clinton administration, African Americans and other people of color were disproportionately arrested, prosecuted, and jailed as part of the ongoing war on drugs. In the meantime, the nation's schools, churches, and neighborhoods remain largely segregated. And the pall of suspicion and surveillance that fell on American citizens and resident aliens of Arab and Middle Eastern background after 9/11 has arguably spread to the rest of the population with the present administration's assault on civil liberties. Now, one could devote an entire lecture to the phenomenon of racial polarization in the 1990s. These are things that we've forgotten or perhaps would like to forget. After all, we've made tremendous progress as a society. Kara Walker's work challenges us to question our assumptions of racial progress since the civil rights era. Can we call it progress when African American actors win Academy Awards for roles that embody white fantasies of black male violence and depravity and black female forgiveness and sexual availability? We are largely free of the blatant minstrel and anti-black visual stereotypes in our popular culture that Walker's work so unapologetically parades before us. Those images are largely the stuff of antique shows and flea markets, collector's items. Yet while these images and objects are relics of a seemingly distant past, those stereotypes and their history have seeped into our cultural bloodstream. They continue to plague us and to silence us. We remain unwilling to disturb a surface politeness in public discourse on race and class, except at crisis moments such as Hurricane Katrina and its aftermath, when racist and anti-racist utterances held center stage for a time. There is otherwise little incentive, despite the urgency of the situation, to discuss and openly question the racial divides, socially and personally, that so define our lives. Kara Walker's work, and the retrospective on it here at the Walker Art Center, thus affords an important opportunity for much-needed dialogue on these crucial issues. As the controversy that has followed Walker attests, there are tremendous risks in her provocative attempts of breaking silences and visualizing the obscene and unspeakable history of racial and sexual domination. Walker's task is further complicated by the fact that the African American community is today perhaps more ideologically divided than it has ever been. No particular voice, political or artistic, speaks for the entire black community, unlike during the civil rights movement, when many African Americans felt represented by leaders and popular artists who were associated with the struggle. Walker has rejected the burden of representation, the responsibility to defend African Americans' honor and dignity that prior and current generations of race men and race women gladly assume. She understands the futility of trying to represent all blacks and the futility of trying to produce work that will be appreciated by all blacks. Besides, what a strange criterion of evaluation that would be for any artist. I want to suggest that those who have criticized Walker are, at bottom, troubled by the inherent instability of using satire and parody to oppose racism. For it is impossible to satirize racism without discussing, representing, showing, and telling all about it. This partly explains the negative response to Walker by African American artists and audiences. Walker is not the only example of this situation in which an anti-racist message is condemned for disturbing the racial peace. A similar case is the periodic banning by school districts of Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, replete with its unsparing depiction of white racism in 19th century Missouri and its frequent use of the N-word. Everything depends on how the novel is taught, and in like fashion with Walker, the effectiveness of the parody of racism hinges on what audiences bring to her artistic enterprise. This retrospective indicates that Walker herself seems to have recognized the need to explain the underlying premises of her work to audiences by incorporating text into her aesthetic repertoire. This makes Walker no less demanding of her audiences, who are being challenged to question preconceived notions of group identity and the myths, stereotypes, and preconceptions upon which they are founded. Walker's volatile and disturbing restagings of slavery in the unspeakable acts performed in its pastoral plantation settings raises to the surface the submerged horrors and traumas in a manner that destabilizes communal identities and moral certainties. Much more is at stake here than the viewer's understanding of the fictive nature of racial stereotypes and his or her own repudiation of racial prejudice. At a moment in which the strategy of racial scapegoating has been taken over by those targeting homosexuals, and amidst the rampant post-feminist objectification of women by men and women, Walker chooses not to let any of us off the hook. Her work requires of us nothing less than the exposure and repudiation of the seductive allure of dominance and subordination in all of its forms. Before I lead you on a historical tour through my own museum exhibition of American racial stereotypes and narratives, I want to say a little bit more about Walker's relation to other African American artists and a black art tradition. Walker is routinely described by commentators as a self-conscious outsider, an unrepentant rebel against those who look to African American art for affirming myths of communal solidarity. I would argue that her visibility and success within the art establishment and her public feuds with other black women artists have blinded many critics, and perhaps even Walker herself, to her situatedness within an African American art tradition among other traditions. It may come as a shock to some when I contend that Kara Walker is engaged in a larger project, fundamentally an anti-racist project, shared by countless other African American artists. Like her contemporaries and predecessors, Walker is entering the already contradictory and unsettling terrain of representing blackness against the dominant American white images of grotesque and degenerate blackness. In other words, Walker is not breaking from, but joining ongoing attempts by other African American artists to visualize blackness in new ways, sometimes by appropriating or repurposing negative stereotypes. Like other black artists, past and present, she shares an interest in using stereotypes in order to disarm and subvert their meaning and affective power. Moreover, like others, she depicts African American resistance through her own depictions of violent revenge by individual slaves, and though her own depictions of revenge by individual slaves occupy the realm of fantasy, they are obviously acts of resistance that can be found in the historical record. While individual slaves did, in fact, exact revenge against their tormentors, as did Celia, a Missouri slave who murdered her master after enduring years of his sexual abuse of her, Walker's depictions of violence stand in contrast to the vision of resistance put forth by such artists as Hale Woodruff, Elizabeth Catlett, and others. Those artists, working in the immediate context of civil rights and progressive movements, were striving to construct a usable past by documenting historical slave rebellions and the activism of abolitionists. For her part, Walker is less invested in depictions of a usable past for African Americans, nor does she subscribe to the view that a vindicating realism, generally referred to by blacks as positive images, would provide a corrective to the onslaught of demeaning images of the black in the white popular imagination. In short, Walker lacks an interest in producing popular, heroic images of strong black men and women, unambiguous resistance, and unfettered agency that the struggle for equality seemed to require of black writers, artists, and scholars. Like others, who have produced literary and scholarly narratives about American slavery, including Toni Morrison, Nell Painter, Saidiya Hartman, Orlando Patterson, and others, Walker is probing the experience of trauma that must have been the central fact of the institution from the standpoint of the enslaved. In exploding the paternalistic myths about slavery by spinning out this repressed history of trauma, and in restaging its scenes of abject horror, Walker's work could be regarded as a visual analog to the Billie Holiday anti-lynching song, Strange Fruit, which juxtaposed evocations of Southern romance and pastoralism with the horrific sights and smells of a recently concluded lynching. Yet what distinguishes Walker from this history of African American protest is its meditation on the interior lives of violated black bodies and the moral ambiguity of her depictions of slavery. That view would be unacceptable to those who seek the consolation of myths that masters were kindly and that slaves were uncompromising in their resistance to slavery. By complicating mythic notions of slavery, that past takes on for Walker, and for us, an allegorical relevance to the lives of Americans. To what extent are we fated to reproduce or resist in our own lives and relationships, and as citizens, the power relations of racial and sexual dominance? And to what extent do those ideologies of racial and sexual dominance serve the larger political ends of political parties and nations? One can find much fruitful discussion of this uniquely American history of racial and sexual myths and practices of superiority and inferiority, and the attendant costs in human alienation in the work of the writer James Baldwin, among others. So far, I have argued against much conventional wisdom that Walker's work has much in common with other African American artists, past and present. Now I want to explore the question, what is the historical basis of these images and scenes in Walker's work? For despite all the controversy and condemnation that has been visited upon Walker, it bears emphasizing that she is representing and reimagining a history not of her own making, and that her own images draw on a vast archive of racial and sexual stereotypes. Those very stereotypes structured Walker's own racialized and gendered interactions with others as a teenager in suburban Georgia. It would seem that, like Walker, African American women continue to experience a unique form of those myths and stereotypes that all too often govern their relationship to others and to American society. And this is not to say that African American men are not equally read quite often in public life as disorderly or as potential criminals. This problem of the racial stereotype for African Americans or other groups can be understood as the problem of an entire category of people being known and condemned to an essential inferiority by and through a single idea or image. When the stereotype is invoked by those with the power to enforce and later to justify that subordination, the results have been and can be catastrophic. Witness the LA riots of 1992, sparked by the acquittal of the policeman who subjected Rodney King to a prolonged beating captured on videotape. Walker's engagement with and manipulation of stereotypes seeks to expose and question the terms and unconscious logic by which stereotypes and their ostensible victims are known. She seeks to redirect the stereotype's obsessive scrutiny of black male and female bodies to the white popular imagination engaged in the dubious act of knowing. Now, I want to talk about some of the historical roots of these stereotypes, and one of the main ideas in this talk is the notion of paternalism. And paternalism is an idea that was serviceable to both the slave-owning class as a justification of slavery, and it was also an idea that was appealing for the antebellum allies of African Americans, the abolitionists. So I'm talking about two kinds of paternalism. Walker's panoramas of antebellum plantation slavery and many of her watercolor and gouache sketches seek to subvert the iconography and narratives of paternalism that have defined not only the pro-slavery ideology of the slave-owning class in the U.S. South, but also the subsequent histories of slavery as they were written for many years by the institution's defenders. Indeed, for generations among historians of U.S. slavery, the thesis of paternalism held sway throughout much of the 20th century. Adherents of paternalism claimed that U.S. slavery was defined by the benevolence of masters, rather than the brutality and dehumanization highlighted by fugitive slaves, authors of slave narratives, and abolitionists in their efforts to destroy the institution. And this is a photograph from a scientific study, and this would be part of the 19th century discourse of scientific racism, whose objective was to establish scientifically through the new medium of photography the inferiority of black people. So this obviously is the kind of depiction of brutality, the kind of instance of brutality that paternalism would try to deny. Paternalism characterized the dominant defense of slavery against its opponents. As I have said, after emancipation, versions of paternalism were invoked long afterward to defend and uphold the status quo of Jim Crow racial segregation during much of the 20th century. Paternalism was more than just an academic interpretation by historians. It was a popular idea with roots in antebellum pro-slavery ideology. Later, paternalism would become a staple in postbellum Southern literature. Still later, American cinematic treatments of slavery were shot through with paternalism, perhaps the most popular of these being the 1939 movie Gone with the Wind. And I'm hoping that in our question and answer period, we can return to some of these images. I'm going to be sort of moving fairly rapidly through them, and if you have any questions or observations that you'd like to make about any of the images, I can certainly recall them for you. Paternalism, describing bonds of love between kindly masters and contented slaves, dominated the popular memory of slavery, not just in the South, but also throughout the American nation. After emancipation and during the period of Reconstruction, in which African Americans possessed civil and voting rights, held electoral office, and exercised political power in the South, white Southern opponents of black participation in political and civic life often waxed nostalgic for the harmonious social relations that were maintained under the discipline of slavery and the idyllic pastoral space of the plantation. By the end of the 19th century, the nostalgia for the Old South plantation culture gained momentum in response to the growing mobility and urban presence of African Americans in the early years of the 20th century. Postbellum narratives of the plantation legend focused on the stereotype of the Negro mammy, who symbolized the loving relationships between masters and slaves in the Old South. The mammy, stout and matronly, as depicted in popular lore and later in film, was a desexualized image, an obvious negation of the incriminating figure of the young female house slave who, as abolitionists had frequently accused, were subjected to the depraved lust of white men in the slave-owning household. The image of the mammy aided many whites in disregarding, if not denying, the more brutal and systemic aspects of anti-black oppression. As one would undoubtedly learn from Kara Walker's visual references to the antebellum anti-slavery movement, abolitionists and Civil War soldiers, paternalism was not monopolized by apologists for slavery and white Southern defenders of postbellum systems of racial subordination and control over the lives and bodies of African American men and women. Abolitionists and others of the anti-slavery persuasion exhibited their own version of paternalism. In their own efforts to liberate the slaves, they took for granted the dependency and lack of agency of the slaves. In the quite extensive visual iconography of abolitionist and anti-slavery paternalism, racial hierarchies of white superiority and black supplication and subordination are central to these images. The kneeling slave, whether male or female, gratefully receiving the gift of freedom, often from a standing white male authority figure, seems to exist for no other reason than to confirm the nobility and virtue of the sentiments of the anti-slavery whites who were consumers of these images. The kneeling slave, hands chained and held aloft, beseeching white public opinion under the banner reading, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And there was another one for the women abolitionists, "Am I not a woman and a sister?" These icons were ubiquitous. This depiction of the male slave's willed subordination was undoubtedly reassuring to those who may have been bothered by actual and imagined threats of slave insurrection. Now, to argue that abolitionists engaged in their own forms of racial paternalism and what the historian George Fredrickson has called romantic racialism, the idea that blacks possessed an innate predisposition to otherworldly Christian faith and forbearance, does not diminish their commitment to ending slavery. However, popular ideologies of racial paternalism during the antebellum era ignored or enabled the collective denial of the myriad this-worldly actions African Americans were taking to liberate themselves. Those who ran away themselves took advantage of the Underground Railroad, the network of anti-slavery activists whose homes and properties were used to shelter fugitive slaves as they fled north toward non-slaveholding territory. In addition, there was the self-emancipation practiced by the so-called contrabands of war, the term for the thousands of slaves who, capitalizing on the chaos of the Civil War, deserted their plantations and sought shelter within the ranks of the Union Army. And I don't know if this is quite clear in this particular image, but you can see a couple of the so-called contrabands of war engaged in domestic work, of laundry work, and you can also see Union soldiers in the background who are posing in a way that may be casual in this case, but they certainly seem to be at military attention. So you have the fugitive slaves in the Underground Railroad, you have the contrabands of war, and then you also have some 180,000 African American troops who bore arms with the Union Army, hoping to play a direct role in the destruction of slavery. Now, the contrabands regarded members of the Union Army as their liberators, but as you can see, they ended up performing various labor for the troops and were not technically free until the end of the Civil War. Throughout the antebellum era, the paternalism of Northern whites might escalate into the sort of murderous mob violence against blacks that erupted in such cities as Philadelphia, and most famously in the so-called draft riots of New York City during July of 1863. In that outbreak of civic unrest, which lasted several days, Irish immigrants, who, by the way, were major consumers of the popular culture of blackface minstrelsy, Irish American immigrants were so angered by the policy that allowed white men of means to purchase exemptions from serving in the Union Army that they systematically attacked African Americans because they had blamed African Americans for being the cause of the Civil War. Images of white paternalism reflected the universal manhood suffrage ideals of Jacksonian democracy, which in several northern states resulted in the restriction of access to voting rights for black men during the antebellum era. Both abolitionist images of white paternalism and stereotypes of blackface minstrelsy seem to bear a direct and anxious relationship to free black communities in the antebellum North and manifestations of African American agency and self-emancipation during the Civil War. That collective agency was rendered invisible by the visual archive of emancipation, produced by and for a white abolitionist public. Visual representations of emancipation were dominated by the iconography of paternalism. Lincoln is a central figure in this iconography. The great emancipator towers over his dependent charges in such a manner as to reassure audiences of the survival of racial hierarchies even after the death of slavery. The submissive posture of emancipated slaves in these images stands in stark contrast to the mobility exhibited by recently freed blacks, who moved to cities in search of employment and personal freedom, and who often traveled in search of relatives and loved ones from whom they had been separated by the whims of slave owners. In contrast to the paternalistic treatment of emancipation, white authority figures are absent from the group sculpture by Meta Warwick Fuller, created for the observance of the 50th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation in New York in 1913. But the standing male and female former slaves seem to face an uncertain future, their poses conveying an ambiguous mood of aspiration but also constraint. And here we have another post-emancipation meditation on the significance of that moment of emancipation, which shows that Walker, like Meta Warwick Fuller many years before, is still working with the problems and the unresolved issues of this post-emancipation, post-slavery moment that really we're all still contending with. Now I want to talk a bit about blackface minstrelsy. I've mentioned it several times before. And blackface minstrelsy structures a lot of these visual images, these visual stereotypes, and narratives, because by the turn of the century, by the late 19th century, there is a story connected with these visual images. And these images stand as a sort of a shorthand for these kinds of cultural and historical narratives of paternalism and black dependency and inequality. Stereotypes originating from blackface minstrelsy represented the cultural dimension of American white supremacy. Minstrelsy has its roots, as many of you no doubt are aware, in antebellum popular culture and involved white entertainers blacking their faces and portraying stereotypical black characters: the lazy slave, the dandified free black, the morally loose Jezebel black woman type. Okay. The most insidious aspect of minstrelsy, heading into much of the 20th century, was its mockery of African Americans' aspirations to equal status. Its insinuation that such aspiration to equality amounted to a futile desire to be white. Minstrel performance rituals in public and increasingly in homes throughout the 20th century freed whites to entertain otherwise forbidden ideas about sexuality. And bear in mind, this is in the Victorian era, where it's not considered appropriate to discuss sexuality in polite society, but minstrel shows would provide an opportunity for a full and frank discussion of these sorts of things. Minstrel shows and performance rituals also assuaged the guilt of whites and enabled them to maintain a sense of moral and racial superiority. In many respects, minstrelsy provided the terms for widespread understandings of racial difference. For many whites, what made blacks not just different, but moral inferiors was their inability to live up to normative, patriarchal, gender, and family relationships. Stereotypical images of blacks derived from minstrelsy were ubiquitous during the turn of the century, a visual counterpart to the consolidation of racial segregation and the repeal of voting rights for blacks by southern states over the course of the 40 years that straddled the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The most powerful and inflammatory images included accusations of Negro domination hurled by white supremacists at black elected officials. And Negro domination, cries of Negro domination were very decisive in the political violence in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, in which a coalition government of African American Republicans and populists were driven from power by political violence. And the state of North Carolina has recently acknowledged that episode in its history and acknowledged that a crime was committed. Now, you had these accusations of Negro domination to discredit the presence of blacks within the polity in the South. You had the stereotype of the worthless Negro who resisted the exploitation of the sharecropping system by seeking better working conditions elsewhere. You also had the myth of the black rapist, which provided the white South's justifications for lynching and other forms of extra-legal violence. And here you have blackface minstrelsy being deployed in the landmark American film Birth of a Nation, which was based on the white supremacist fictions of Thomas Dixon. And here you see the Negro marauder Gus, who has caused the death of one of the white blonde female characters in Birth of a Nation by attempting to rape her. And the Klan is in process, as you can see, of meting out its retribution or justice, as it would have been called. And it's really ironic, if you've seen, and I'm sure many of you have seen the film Birth of a Nation, that the characters in Birth of a Nation who embody African American stereotypes are actually portrayed by white actors in blackface. And in fact, there is a mammy character, a woman, mammy, black mammy character, who is portrayed by a white man in blackface to sort of reinforce that notion of the sort of pathological gender differences that are really central to notions of racism. So these stereotypes, particularly the latter notion of the black man prone to despoil white womanhood, and pure white womanhood is one of those operative stereotypes of whiteness that was crucial for the ideological functioning and justifications of the repressive violence in the Jim Crow order. These images, particularly the notion of the black man as rapist, were ubiquitous as rationalization of lynching, even though black women were lynched as well throughout this period. Such stereotypes and myths proliferated in popular culture, newspapers, magazines, toys, advertisements, and the like. Minstrelsy would acquire an even greater semblance of realism in the minds of many whites through the use of mass communications technologies of recorded sound, radio and motion pictures, and mass-produced illustrations and photographs. And bear in mind that Dixon, in trying to promote the film Birth of a Nation, had the film screened in the White House and had shown the film to members of Congress and the Supreme Court as well. Woodrow Wilson, who was president at the time, praised the film as history written with lightning, and Dixon was going to show the film to a member of the Supreme Court, and this particular justice said, "Oh, I don't have any time for films. So, films are a waste of time. They're vulgar, cheap amusements. Just please take it away." And Dixon, as he was being shown the door, told the justice that, "No, this is a film about the Ku Klux Klan." And the justice said, "Wait a minute, I was in the Klan." So he watched the film. The elaborate nature of minstrel stereotypes was hardly random or accidental. These images evolved into a visual shorthand linking narratives of antebellum, black minstrelsy, and slavery with postbellum notions of the plantation legend. These images and narratives called for the reassertion of control over black labor. They also called for the maintenance of white racial purity and the confinement of all black Americans to the subordinate status of non-citizens. Through mass-produced images that were circulated nationwide, blacks were shown in rural scenes. And I could just show literally dozens of these images. Would go quite into the wee hours if we could sort of do justice to the vastness of that visual record. And often African Americans in these depictions were associated with cotton to reflect white expectations of their place and function within the Jim Crow New South social order. Blacks were not to be employed in the New South industries of textile mills. Those were reserved for poor whites, working class whites. But blacks were meant to be confined in the very same labor pastime that occupied them under slavery. And there are so many of these kinds of images, and I really thought it would be very interesting to show them in connection with a Kara Walker retrospective, because you do have that contrast, that play of black and white in many of these kinds of images. Now, while the simple joys of African Americans in these stereotyped postcards, the simple joys of banjo playing, watermelon, and fried chicken eating made them virtually unexploitable, like children, they still needed discipline to counter their propensity for laziness. The popular coon song craze of the 1890s was full of these minstrel narratives that sought to permanently associate black people, mostly young. Well, these are clearly cotton pickers in training. Black people with cotton production in the South, but also with those kinds of stereotypical leisure pursuits. From this perspective, urban migration signaled indolence rather than blacks' legitimate aspirations to escape demeaning and exploitative labor as field hands. And in the 1890s, 90% of the black population is residing in the South. And in the early years of the 20th century, you start to see the beginnings of migration cityward, first to towns and cities in the South, and then during World War I, migration in huge numbers to urban centers in the North, such as Detroit, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and the like. But migration was a form of direct resistance to the Jim Crow social order that demanded that African Americans remain within the shadow of the plantation. Minstrel stereotypes provided the intellectual and emotional basis for arguments that black people were biologically inferior, disorderly, carnal rather than cerebral, vulnerable to disease and mortality in cities, far from plantation life. Blacks were unfit for political rights, voting, and civic responsibilities. And this is an interesting image, and this is one of those images where you're sort of not quite sure which way it cuts. It's from the Harper's Weekly in the 1870s or so, it's contemporaneous with Reconstruction, and you can see the depiction of African Americans serving on juries, as they were able to do under Reconstruction governments in the South. But again, you can see the minstrel representation of the blacks on this jury here, and you're not quite sure whether or not this is a representation that is supportive of African American political participation or mocking it, as those scenes of the South Carolina legislature in the movie Birth of a Nation were clearly demeaning and mocking African American political participation. Ultimately, the Negro was viewed as so different as to be unassimilable. For indeed, the basis for incorporation to full American citizenship was the ability to lay claim to the ideology of whiteness. In 1900, the Harvard biologist and public intellectual Nathaniel Southgate Shaler wrote in the Atlantic Monthly that, quote, "Coons will get wild when there was a racket going on, but all they will need is the firm hand of the master race," end of quote. African Americans of all walks of life employed photography as a means of challenging minstrel depictions of blackness with dignified images of what they would have called the representative Negro. And here you have a studio portrait, and studio photography was sort of a burgeoning black business in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And I think that there is a very self-conscious desire on the part of those who posed for these kinds of portraits to counter the negative image of African Americans that was so pervasive. So you don't see, and perhaps this has to do with the technology of photography at that time, you don't see people smiling, perhaps because of the lengthy time of exposure for the photograph, but I think also for ideological and political reasons as well. Indeed, the very character of African American leadership during the 1890s was transformed by the pervasive slanders against black women by white commentators, fueled by the stereotype of black women as promiscuous and sexually available. The National Association of Colored Women was established during the 1890s after a white journalist had insinuated that virtue was non-existent among black women. And the National Association for Colored Women was part of a social movement among black women. It was really the African American counterpart to the white middle-class women's club movement, which was segregated. And many African American middle-class women who wanted to be involved in civic affairs, in reform movements, had to establish their own movement and organization, as did many other African American professionals, leaders, organizations, in a time of profound racial segregation. African American women were as subject to sexual domination under Jim Crow segregation in the South as they had been preyed upon during slavery. Many publicly active black men and women denounced the systematic phenomenon of concubinage, this is what it was called, the sexual exploitation of black women by white employers. It became a struggle and a badge of honor in some black middle-class families during the era of Jim Crow, both in the North and in the South, to keep their daughters out of the homes of white employers as domestic servants. They would thus be relatively safer from the kind of sexual assault that came to be perceived as a rite of passage for white Southern men. Now, I want to say, in conclusion, a few more words about stereotypes. Historically, racial stereotypes of blackness have functioned to solve a fundamental moral problem at the heart of the American Republic, and this is a problem that really dates back to the genesis, to the founding of the American nation. How could a Christian nation founded on political ideals of democracy reconcile itself to the institution of chattel slavery and later Jim Crow segregation with its degradation of fellow human beings. Now, quite a bit of explanation was required. And so there was certain ideologies of race, racial difference, scientific racism that I referred to earlier in the context of the antebellum era, but continuing quite extensively into the turn of the century, well into the 20th century, intended to prove and really confirm ideas of the subhuman status of blacks. During the antebellum era, you also had biblical defenses of slavery, and in many pulpits, the pro-slavery doctrine was preached. Moreover, racial stereotypes propagated by blackface minstrelsy asserted the happiness and contentment of the enslaved. Now, racial stereotypes provided reassurance to whites that the repressive nature of systems of racial domination, whether the lash of slavery or the lynching rope of segregation, were necessary to discipline and punish blacks for their propensity for crime and for trying to escape their lowly status in society. Stereotypes of blackness are far less visible in our culture, I would argue, but as I have suggested, they structure much of the, and they structure at the level of narrative much of our society's assumptions and commentary about race. In order to challenge that history, we need to take a cold, hard look at those stereotypes and their harmful impact on their victims and on our society. And that is precisely what Kara Walker's work asks us to do. Thank you. So at this moment, I'm looking forward to some discussion and questions in which I will have the opportunity to recall one of the images that intrigued you before and to elaborate on some of the ideas that I perhaps skipped over a bit too rapidly. There are people who have microphones. I think I have to stay at home here. Maybe there's a microphone for me. There's a question.
Yes, hi. Thank you for the discussion. Just a really quick question. I mean, well, a couple of questions, but with regards to stereotypes, you did talk a little bit about how African Americans responded to those stereotypes with the formations of various clubs. Could you speak a little bit more on the reactions of African Americans to those stereotypes with regards to the arts and the arts movement, and as it also played out in the Harlem Renaissance, and even more recently in the forms of sort of stereotypes that I guess that one would see in some popular images, like the Amos and Andy in the 1950s, and then certainly things like Good Times and Different Strokes, for instance, on television.
Did you say
Is it Different Strokes? I think in terms of television, in terms of understanding the role of the racial hierarchy that you spoke of.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. I think I've been trying to say that we haven't had the same kinds of blatant negative minstrel stereotypes, but nevertheless, if we go back into the 1980s and 1990s, we can certainly find examples of stereotypes that reflected, I suppose, popular white fantasies. But just to talk about African Americans' responses to stereotypes, during the period in which Birth of a Nation premiered in 1915, and the movie was revived several times over the next few years into the 1920s. And when the movie was first premiered, the NAACP led, and also, I believe, civil libertarians as well, led a movement to censor the Birth of a Nation, to stop its release and distribution. The film, those attempts were unsuccessful. The film was distributed and shown nationwide, and really sort of seeped into the popular culture. And it's one of those instances in which popular culture had a formative effect on academic and scholarly discourse, because in the 1920s you start to see the pro-Southern, pro-Redeemer Thomas Dixon, D.W. Griffith interpretation of Reconstruction becoming institutionalized in U.S. history textbooks, not just in scholarly monographs, but also in textbooks written for younger readers and students. And so Birth of a Nation was a major part of a sort of a intensification of racial polarization in American society after World War I. As far as African Americans' responses to stereotypes, I think it's really important to emphasize, as I try to suggest in my talk, that stereotypes should be seen as reactions to African Americans' social advancement, their demands for equality, for their achievement of a fair degree of social progress. And so you can see the minstrel mockery of free blacks and their attempts to organize their communities in the antebellum period in cities in the North. You can see the response of these minstrel stereotypes to the urbanization of the black population. And so I think that African Americans certainly have felt compelled, really had no choice, didn't have the luxury of doing something different the way perhaps artists are able to do today. They had no choice to try to counter those sorts of negative images. But in many respects, those negative images were proliferating and being reproduced. And this is a really sort of a powerful moment at the turn of the century in which these new mass communications technologies, the ability to print and mass produce these postcard images, really provides a new way of reproducing ideologies of race and common sense knowledge about race for the majority population. Just to go back to the 1980s, it is interesting that you did have a proliferation of these sitcoms with black boys whose growth was somehow stunted. And I think that you can draw your own conclusions about what that might have meant at that particular moment. Okay, I can sort of see hands going up, but the lighting is not in my favor in that regard.
I wondered if you might be able to go back to the image of the funeral procession. I believe it was the third or fourth slide that you showed.
Okay. Okay. Okay, that's. Okay.
You slide up, I think.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I got it.
There you
are. Oh, God. Okay, where's the show?
I think people can probably see the image. There you go. Thank you.
Okay.
When you first displayed this on the screen, I was, of course, looking at it quite intently as you were speaking. And in the back of my mind, I was saying, I've seen this before. Where is it that I've seen this image before? And it took me a while, and then I recalled where I had originally seen this wonderful painting. And it turns out that I saw this painting hanging on the dining room wall of an African-American family that I visited every week in the 1990s, and the family was Claire Huxtable, and on the Bill Cosby show. I wonder if you wanted to talk a little bit about the contrast between the 1990s images that the Cosby show was presenting in comparison to the other images of racism that were also as prevalent in that era.
Thank you. Yes, for reminding me that this image is on loan from the collection of Claire Huxtable. I think the Cosby Show was part of this earlier black political aesthetic that I was talking about. The view that positive images of a dignified presentation of African American life and its diversity, its talent. I mean, the Cosby Show was certainly worth watching for its showcasing of black talent and all these legendary figures in certainly in the jazz world. And in the set on the Cosby Show, I think there was a self-conscious, subliminal attempt to send a message that this, extremely affluent black middle-class family were very much grounded in a tradition of struggle and a sense of a proud sense of their black cultural heritage. And you can think of the anti-apartheid posters in Theo's room and all the like. But bear in mind, at the same time, I believe the end of the Cosby Show coincided with the LA riots. And I really think that the Cosby Show was wonderful. I still enjoy watching it and looking for all those visual cues and seeing Miriam Makeba doing a guest shot on the Cosby Show and all that. But at the same time, for all of its impact, I think you can see that approach, that view, that idealism, that if we could just show African Americans as we really are and portray them in an honorable way, that would solve problems of racism. I just think that that's a very, it's a noble sentiment, but it's not much more than that. And so I think that Kara Walker is certainly not opposed to that. I think she's just interested in doing something different. And I think that what her work suggests to me is the extent to which we all can reflect on how histories of oppression affect us. And for blacks, I think that she's really concerned about issues of internalized racism, issues of identification with the oppressor. And in a time of resurgent conservatism and black conservatism and what my colleague Angela Dillard has called multicultural and gay and lesbian conservatism, identification with oppressors it's a very serious issue. And so I think that Walker is moving us beyond that particular aesthetic and asking us to ask deeper questions of ourselves and how we as a culture and as members of a culture can be sort of traumatized in some way by what passes for dominant knowledge about race. And I think that this is a problem that certainly Walker has not, or a response to the problem that Walker has not originated. I think African American writers and writers of African descent, going back to the era of the civil rights movement and the decolonization movement, were writing about this problem of alienation, the problem of black people in a majority white Western European American culture, and dealing with that alienating experience of being marked is fundamentally different. Fanon has written about it, James Baldwin, all these people have written about it, and I really do think that it's helpful to think of Walker as participating in that kind of project. I think that with all the controversy around Walker, we tend to think of her as someone who is completely out there on a limb doing something completely new and original, and I think that there's a lot to be there's a case to be made for that within the context of the art world. But I am interested in seeing connections between what Walker is doing and what other Black writers and artists have done.
I wonder if you could talk just about, both in your own lecture and you're looking at Carol Walker's work, with the way in which history functions in the work, in that, I guess I'm thinking about the way in which you started, which was to suggest that these are contemporary, sort of interventions in contemporary politics, which would suggest that showing images like the film shots that you showed that sort of are sort of very immediate comments on contemporary culture may be more effective at doing that than to sort of to go back to draw on historical images, and which I don't think is what she's trying to do. I mean, I think obviously she sees some resonance between history and the present. So I guess I wonder what sort of both, and also in your lecture, the images that you showed were all historical images, which on one hand could have the impact of suggesting that these are all issues that are confined to the past and that are problems that are confined to the past.
Well, that's a pretty huge and complicated question, and I guess I would just begin by saying that Walker is drawing on a lot of the images, the historical images that I showed. I showed them to give a sense of the historical references. Walker is someone who produces her work and her representations of plantation slavery based on a lot of historical research. There are resonances within a lot of contemporary fiction and scholarship on slavery. So Walker is not someone who is operating solely in the realm of fantasy. There's a historical basis for that, and I was really drawn to showing some of these historical images because they do have a sort of an interesting resonance with Walker's use of silhouette and that contrast of black versus white, particularly in those postcards that depict the contrast between the black boys and the white background of the cotton, and really shows the importance of assumptions about political economy in the status of black people, or dominant notions of the status of black people at the turn of the century. Now, I think that for Walker, slavery just becomes an allegory for very contemporary issues and concerns, and how American society and the majority of Americans repressed the history of slavery and brutality and trauma that was central to it, and so she wants to kind of bring that back out. But also how people have, for African Americans, have very sort of self-serving notions of that past themselves. They want to believe that no slave women consented to sexual relations, that they were all raped by the slave master. There are certain kinds of reassuring truths and myths that we tell ourselves to confirm our assumptions about strong black ancestors who fought back and protested. I'm looking at African American activists in my book during the Civil Rights era, and they would tell all these family stories about the uncle who had a physical altercation with the white landowner and had to flee and escaped the lynch mob and all that sort of thing. The kinds of stories that we tell in our family history are not the kinds of stories that are the stuff of Walker's work. And I think that to deny that fact, these sort of murky gray areas in the history of slavery and racial oppression is, I think, perhaps doing ourselves a disservice and perhaps remaining invested in the kinds of myths that that don't really help us. When I look at these panoramic scenes of slavery, I'm thinking about the ways in which not just the enslaved people, the female house slaves, consented to their oppression. I'm thinking about, why is it that, young women allow themselves to be objectified in hip-hop videos today? And what does it mean for, black men who are making it as hip-hop impresarios to figuratively and perhaps literally enslave the women who are made to behave in a certain way within this particular situation? So I think that Walker is using history as a way to ask these deeply contemporary questions, and I think that this is a very fascinating and interesting project in which the historical veracity of her representations of slavery becomes sort of beside the point. I don't know if that begins to address your question, but as you can see from my choice of images, I am interested in how we define progress today. Walker says in one of her textual drawings, she talks about how we're supposed to be so excited about some white television executive picking an attractive young black woman to serve as a news anchor, and how that's described as progress. And she can't help but see that within the context of some slave owner or some privileged white male within a system of domination selecting a mistress like Jefferson selecting Sally Hemings or something like that. So for me, I'm obviously interested in talking about the relationship of Walker's work to these images as they've sort of come down to us through history, and I think that that's a visual archive that Walker's commenting on. If you go back to that, the chicken, what is it, the before the battle, she's inverting that whole discourse of the representation of emancipation by having the soldier in the subordinate position, but also challenging that notion of the soldier as the liberator. It's clear. I mean, she's using the stereotype of her of the enslaved woman, the contraband eating chicken, really to suggest that this is a rape, this is an attack. In my reading of this image, and I think that what she's trying to do is she's not letting anybody off the hook here. As I said, you've got the slave owners who are engaged in these acts of sexual domination, but here you have the ostensible liberator, the liberal, who is just as invested in this relationship of dominance and subordination. Yes. What happened to the microphone?
A personal question.
There's a question right here.
Oh. Are you at all a collector, and who would you recommend if you were collecting black artists?
Okay, all right. Am I a collector? I'm a sometime collector. I did a lot of collecting of these images in the context of my first book, which was really about ideologies of race in the late 19th and early 20th century. And I have found with the stringency of intellectual property laws that it's good to be a collector because you don't have to, you can give yourself permission to use your own image, basically. You don't have to worry about, going to some other entity. There was a follow-up to that question, and I'm not quite sure I got all of it. Do I recommend? Wait, let's wait for the microphone. And then there's another question down here.
Do you recommend any particular black artist at this time if you were a collector? I have a few pieces, but I'm open to looking at
okay. Well, I am not a collector of African American art. I'm just one of those boring historians who collects these images because they're grist for my interpretive mill. And so I can't recommend any artists to collect, although I suppose I would like to. So we do have a question down here.
Thanks. I have sort of a comment and a question.
Mm-hmm.
I think class is very important, and you talk about that in your work. And I think one of the problems that we tend to have is that blacks become monolithic in the way we view ourselves as well as the way others view us. And when you raised the question, you raised the question about the funeral procession. And for those of us who watched the Cosby Show in particular for years, there were several things that were going on. Middle-class white people said, "Oh my goodness, this is exactly what's happening in my household." Middle-class professional black people were looking at the images and saying, "Oh yeah, I have that, and I have that, and oh yeah, I remember doing this, I remember doing that." And for many of us, this was just a confirmation of what we'd been doing for generations in our lives. This was our lives. For white Americans, oh my goodness, the Cosbys became white professionals rather than a representation of black professionals that had been living like this for generation after generation. Similarly, people look at this, oh my goodness, this is a class issue. This is a poor black woman, right? Newly emancipated black woman who is taken advantage of because of her class as well as her race, because class and race are mixed here. But I think for today you have to understand the dynamic between what intellectual blacks think about our narrow worldview and what's represented by the larger worldview of the majority of blacks who are not intellectual and middle class. So the whole question of hip-hop, selling blacks, skin, and all that, that's money-making for a poor, very cute, bootylicious black woman who finds that this is the way you make money and get out of being poor. So there are many levels here that you have to look at. And it's hard. I hope you can hear me. I don't know. It's very hard, I think, to try to distinguish the difference between this reality that she's showing us that most black people wouldn't even understand because they're not looking at it in the intellectual way that scholars and students would understand it. And I don't understand how we separate that, how we make people understand that class is as important as race, although race and class are very intertwined in American life.
I agree, and I think that the class politics around representations in hip-hop culture are fascinating and challenging because I think that there's been a cultural shift in the United States within the black community. The point that I made about the black community is not unified anymore, or does not have that sense of itself as unified that you had perhaps in the civil rights movement. I think that there are a lot of, if you talk about black culture and what black culture is, my notion of black culture is going to be very different from that of my students. And that's a generational notion, divide. It's a class divide as well. And, I am someone who is of that earlier generation who's sort of with Cosby, who really feels that the positive images, the positive dignified representations, things like Roots, just if we could get that truth out there in terms of a history of race and slavery in the United States would be a transformative thing. And my notion of black culture is, I suppose, inflected by modern jazz and cultural expressions, expressive cultures that would be seen as connected to the struggle for equality, Lorraine Hansberry and Raisin in the Sun, things like that. That's fairly meaningless for many younger African Americans, and perhaps there is more of a sense of that earlier black culture that transcends the kinds of class differences that you were talking about. But today, it's clear that we're living in a moment in which the social movements of the 1950s and 60s and 70s, which were so formative for us, and during which the standard for the black community was set by civil rights protesters in the South who demonstrated and got arrested and herded into the paddy wagons wearing their Sunday best. That was the standard. If you're gonna go in public, you were going to be well turned out, and you were going to show that you were somebody and you were dignified. And now it seems that the cultural standard for the African American community is quite different. It's the outlaw, the gangster, that sort of thing. That becomes the representative Negro today. Whereas at the turn of the century and throughout the 20th century, for African Americans, the representative Negro would have been leaders like Mrs. Bethune or Paul Robeson, or people like that who projected a certain amount of dignity. I was playing for students not too long ago a audio taped interview with Paul Robeson. And for those of you who've heard his voice, he's got this deep bass speaking voice, and obviously was a singer, an actor as well. And one of the students said, "He's black. He's not talking like a black person." And I'm thinking, well, where did you get that idea from? So we brought out the documentary of Paul Robeson and find out who he was and what he was about, and you can rethink that whole notion of what is an appropriate black way of being. Any other questions?
It was a really interesting comment, and of course, I wanted to just kind of say one more thing on that, and that it's almost one has to almost bring in the historic portion of that. I mean, you talked about African Americans having there's a difference in culture, and one of the things, and African Americans not being monolithic, but I also think that the image of what is African American or what is black culture comes so much out of the slave or the idea of slavery, and African Americans were part of the whole, for the most part, all African Americans were slaves. I, for one, am from Philadelphia, for instance, and there are many African Americans can point back to their heritage, and they were not slaves, or they were emancipated well before the Civil War, and so their culture, of course, is also very different, and it also plays out. So it goes back even further than that, I think, and so we have to always be really careful about how we approach African American culture. And understanding that it is different, and that as we come down through generations, that there are different ways in which people define what it means to be black. I wanted to make that comment, but I also wanted to just go back to the Kara Walker image that you had of the chicken dumping the before the battle, and one of the things that I also see, and I wanted to just kind of comment on, because you talked about Kara Walker actually pulling in historic images. And one of the things, again, coming from a part of the country where the Society of Friends, or the Quakers, were very prevalent, certainly in the 19th century, the silhouette was what the Society of Friends would have. That's the image, the black and white image that you would see in most of the historic images of those persons who were part of that particular religious sect. And I'm wondering if Kara Walker is sort of playing off of that as well. And you didn't mention that, so I'm just wondering if if you have any comment on that.
Well, I'm not familiar with that image, and
okay.
Yeah.
The Quakers in the 19th century, they would never have shown. They would have only shown the silhouette for the most part, or profile of themselves. And so, if you were to see early images of members of the Society of Friends, it would be this sort of black and white, sort of profiled silhouette image. Which was more typical of that period.
Yeah, I mean, the silhouette image is a 19th century popular image, and art historians have said many more interesting things about Walker's use of that 19th century form than I'm going to say. But I think that the statement that you made about the diversity of the African American community and black culture shows. What I take from that is that the very notion of African American culture is contested now, and we're not going to agree what constitutes African American culture. Now, I really think that this question of what is the basis of the black community in relation to a history of slavery is a new issue. I don't remember people historically trying to make distinctions, other than the distinction between, say, native-born blacks and black immigrants from the Caribbean and those kinds of historic tensions. I don't remember people trying to talk about the diversity of the black community by making reference to a historical experience of slavery that is somehow the basis of African American, group identity or culture. That's a new thing to me, and I'm very, very curious as to why that's the case. My sense is that it has to do with the fact that we live in a post-civil rights era. There is no unifying struggle. There's been a certain amount of social stratification in the black population. So you've got folks who are sort of stuck in the ghetto, and folks who have moved on, and again, there's no unifying struggle that would sort of convince African Americans, who have always been diverse, who have always been cosmopolitan, that they're in the same boat. And there was an imposed unity by the institution of segregation that is not so much the case anymore, although racial profiling certainly could provide a basis for that kind of unity. And I think that we have to be careful when we talk about African American culture, because when you talk about slavery being the basis of African American culture, I don't know what that means. Maybe it means Paul Robeson singing Negro spirituals, but I don't particularly see that as African American culture. But I guess these sorts of issues are very murky, and the thing that gives me pause and concerns me a little bit is people who say, well, we were never slaves. Well, that may be, but what does that mean? And what is the purpose of saying that? There was a controversy at Harvard a few years ago in which lots of immigrants of African descent made a point of disassociating themselves from African Americans because they were not slaves. What? That's ridiculous. I mean, what are they doing in the Western Hemisphere? Or were they not the product of some New World slavery system? Okay? They didn't come from Africa. So I just think that kind of fetish for disassociating oneself is very problematic, and I think it's symptomatic of the moment in which we live in which it just seems to be something that is not in the interest of black people. It seems to be something that is originating from someplace else, from a sort of a divide and conquer mentality. This business that Barack Obama is not African American because he's not descended from African American slaves. Well, Condoleezza Rice is descended from African American slaves. So is Clarence Thomas. So what does that mean? It's just I think sort of pointless political manipulation. Well, not pointless, obviously.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah, I guess you kind of touched on this in your comments for the last question. I guess one of the things that I was wanting to hear more about, and I think this was brought up by the previous question too, that you talked about Kara Walker's work as you're I guess revisiting or bringing to the light things that people don't want to talk about or don't want to think about. I guess can have two different meanings that seem like they're kind of the same but are not. On the one hand, you have just the kind of mundane bring to light historical facts, and on the other hand, you have bring to light psychological facts, I guess. And I guess I didn't hear as much about the second, about how Kara Walker's work does kind of accomplishes kind of the second function, and didn't know if you thought bring to light historical facts was more important, or maybe it functions in the service of the second. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the way I see Walker, I think she's interested in the dominant phenomenon of stereotyping, which is what I've talked about tonight. But I think she's interested in the ways in which we stereotype ourselves, who are victims of this kind of sort of cultural and social stereotyping and denigration, how we can stereotype ourselves with sort of rigid notions of what it means to be black and what's possible to desire. I mean, when I was growing up, I like all kinds of music, but, in my neighborhood, I couldn't go around publicly, with country music on my stereo or something like that. I mean, that's a kind of a perhaps trivial example, but I think it gives you a sense of how the stereotypes produce a reaction. Okay, no, this is who I am. I'm the representative Negro. I'm not that distortion. I'm not that stereotype. But that there are distortions in that sort of counter to the original stereotype, in this assertion of who I am and who black people ought to be as a people. And I think that Walker is interested in challenging that, and she's interested in challenging not just the stereotypes that the dominant society has of black men and black women, but the stereotypes that we have of ourselves. And if you read James Baldwin's Another Country, these poor self-deluded people are living out their lives and their relationships through these stereotypes without even knowing it, and trying to figure out, why they can't write that book or why they can't fall in love or things like that. It's because they're reenacting this whole historical drama of Uncle Tom. When the black musician picks up the white woman, they're all talking about her, in terms of these stereotypes, Miss Anne and that kind of thing. It's just ridiculous. So I guess I'm interested in how Walker is asking us to think about how, in responding to these dominant stereotypes, we create and reproduce and propagate stereotypes of our own. And then that becomes the basis for authentic black being, and it's not true. It's not who we are. We have to question who we are, particularly in the kind of times that we live in, or who we think we are. And that goes really for everybody, but so.